Welcome to the segment on managing global financial crises, the International Monetary Fund. And in this segment of videos, what we're going to discuss is not only how to predict whether a country is going to have a financial crisis, but once that country has the crisis, how do you as an international manager deal with it? How could that potentially offer you some opportunities? What are some things to avoid? What are some things to know? And so by understanding all this, I think it can be very useful in developing more effective strategy for dealing with these crises. Along the way, we're also going to learn a lot about this crucially important institution in the global economy, the International Monetary Fund, which the actions of this IMF are also extremely relevant to you as an international manager. So that's why all of this is very important. And what I'm going to do, though, is we'll start by talking about something very abstract and conceptual, but I promise you as we go along, you'll see how relevant and important that is to have this basic understanding. And then we can move on and start talking about these financial crises, et cetera. So let's start with, as I mentioned, this very conceptual, abstract sort of thing. What are the three basic prerequisites for a successful global economy? And I promise you this will be relevant as we go along. So bear with me. But just hang on there. But here's what I wanted to mention this. So you see this sort of pie chart here with the three basic prerequisites: liquidity, adjustment, and confidence. And I'll be explaining some more of the text on the right in a moment. But I want to first start out by basically, what is this liquidity? Liquidity just means that there is enough money in circulation in that successful global economy to handle big international trade transactions. That's all it means. Adjustment means that if a country gets into a trade deficit, in other words, it's importing more than it exports, there needs to be some way for that country's economy to get back into balance, to get back into equilibrium. By the same token, if a country has a big trade surplus, there needs to be some mechanism for adjustment as well. So that's what that means, the adjustment mechanism, getting a country's trade balance back into equilibrium. And then confidence means that, of course, if companies and individuals are going to be engaging in these big international transactions, they need to have confidence in the money that is being used to handle these transactions. And so that's the three basic prerequisites right there. Now, to the text there on the right, you'll notice that in the 16th century, countries really had a liquidity problem because this is before the invention of paper money. So there simply was only a finite amount of units of transaction available. And back then, what people used was gold and silver. And economists like to refer to gold and silver as specie. Not sure why. But in any case, because the only money available was this specie, gold and silver, and there's a finite amount of gold and silver available in the world, of course, that, of course, limited the size of the economy, the global economy. It was limited by the amount of gold and silver available to handle trade transactions. So there was a liquidity problem. At the same time, when people only used gold and silver, everyone had confidence in the money that was being used because everyone knew the value. It was quite obvious what the value of the gold and silver was. In terms of the adjustment mechanism, well, that was a little more difficult because if a country had a big trade deficit and it wasn't earning enough, was having trade problems with exporting its products, there really wasn't much it could do except to let the prices for its whatever it was producing, let's say coconuts, they would have to fall in world markets sufficiently so that the country could start exporting again. So that was a very difficult and painful process of adjustment of the trade balance. So these are some of the limitations and constraints of the economy that only uses, gold and silver. Okay, now in the 18th century, what happened is a British economist named David Hume. His name was David Hume. He came up with what he called the price specie flow mechanism idea. And this is a liberal idea. Think about this. Try to think, why is it a liberal idea as I'm explaining it? And maybe you can jot down the answer while I'm saying it. But in any case, basically, this is how the idea worked. The reason that what David Hume said is that, let's say a country is very successful in its trade, and this is a country that in an economy, the global economy, where only gold and silver specie is being used, right? So let's say that a country is very successful in its trade. It's exporting lots of products. That means that lots of specie, gold and silver, will flow in, right? So people are paying for those products. As the country exports, the specie flows in. Now, in that country's economy, with all of this gold and silver flying around, that means that, that's going to start driving up the price for products in that country's economy, right? Prices will start to rise. Now, what's interesting, as those prices rise, it's now going to be more difficult for that country to sell its products because its products are more expensive in that country relative to products in other countries. So what's very interesting about this is as the specie flows in, the country is successful at exports, the specie flows in, all that extra money sloshing around in the economy starts to drive up prices. And then it becomes difficult for this country that had this huge, export boom. It becomes difficult for that country to export. In fact, people in that country said, we'd rather buy things from other countries where the prices are lower. So then they start to take that gold and silver, the specie, and it flows out again. It flows out to pay for imports from other countries. And so as the specie flows out of the country's economy, there is less money circulating in the economy. The prices come back down, and the trade balance gets back in equilibrium. So do you see this? In an economy, in a global economy where every country uses gold and silver as its unit of transaction, there's an automatic adjustment mechanism. People have confidence in the unit of exchange. There, of course, is a liquidity problem, but at least there's an automatic adjustment mechanism. Now, why is that a liberal idea? Okay, the reason it's a liberal idea is that this happened just because market forces made it happen. The government didn't mandate, we're going to have a trade balance, we're going to have trade surplus, it's just the market forces brought that country's economy back into equilibrium, brought its trade balance back into equilibrium. As prices rose, the other things happened, and then it just all automatically just occurred. So there was no active government intervention. It was the invisible hand of the market forces. Now, this is all great until the mid-18th century. This is why David Hume was remembering how great the the specie process was. There was a problem when in the 18th century paper money was invented. And what happened is at that point, government said, wait a minute, we are the ones that print this stuff. We can actually run the printing presses and print as much money as we need. If we're having problems meeting our government payroll 1 month, we can just print some money. If we want to pay money for a war or something, we just print the money. And so governments have this ability, right? So governments began doing this a lot. And so the problem with this is when governments printed a lot of their local currency in this way, it put a lot of that local currency into circulation in that country's economy. And just like it did with all that specie that was sloshing around in a country's economy, more money chasing after the same amount of goods. This is what economists love to use that terminology. More money chasing after the same amount of goods brought up a rise in price in those goods, increased demand for those goods, right? It drops out the price. Inflation, okay? And so what governments began to notice is that increased inflation, that higher prices in their country's economy made it difficult for them to export their products because their products now were higher in price than other countries' products. So what they did is they said, what can we do to make our products cheaper? What can we do? We have a big trade deficit. It's easier or cheaper for people to import things than it is for us to export. We have a big trade imbalance. What can we do? So here's what governments realized. They said, wait a minute. If we print even more of our local currency, that'll increase the supply of currency that is available. That increased supply will lower the value of the currency. And that means that our products, priced in terms of our now very weak currency, will seem cheaper to people in countries that have strong, stable currencies. They won't need as much money to buy our products because the exchange rate, we've made our products cheaper because they're in terms of our weak currency. And so, this is really amazing. So if it costs, $1 to buy a gadget in Mexico, and that is equivalent to 10 pesos, and Mexico increases the amount of pesos in circulation, And so now that increased supply of pesos lowers the value. Now it's still 10 pesos, but for people in the United States, you can take $1 and exchange it for 20 pesos now, right? And so you only need 50 cents to buy the gadget. So it seems like there's a discount. And so basically what has happened then is that this increased supply of currency that countries began doing, that caused their currencies to devalue, that made their products seem cheaper to people in other countries holding strong, stable currencies. That meant it was very easy now for them to export. And so suddenly, countries realized what they were doing. They said, oh my gosh, all we have to do is just print a lot more currency and our trade deficit will disappear. We'll have a trade surplus. But you see what happened? With that huge increase in local currencies circulating in their economy, inflation came back even stronger and prices rose even higher. And so government said, well, okay, we can't export our products anymore. What can we do? Well, hey, let's print a lot more currency, you see? And that began the vicious cycle of just printing more and more currency to make a devaluation happen and to make their products more competitive in other countries' markets. And suddenly the inflation went from just, maybe a few percent a year to hundreds of percent a year to thousands of percent a year. That's what we call hyperinflation. And so some countries, I think it was Zimbabwe a few years back, their inflation rate from doing this repeatedly, right, got up to like 20,000% a year. And so this is a common problem. And so this, after paper money was invented, this was the real problem. And so here's what happened. There was one country that got fed up with us, and they were disgusted with this because they were the dominant economy of the era. We're talking about Great Britain. And Great Britain was the hegemon, right? Which means it's the dominant economy, the dominant political power, the dominant technological power of that era. And so Great Britain said, we would like to export our superior manufactured goods to the rest of the world. Of course, we'll keep importing their coconuts and things. That's fine. We'll buy those things. But we want to export our manufactured products. Remember, Great Britain, the first country to experience the Industrial Revolution, Great Britain said, we want to export our manufactured products to the rest of the world. Okay? So to do that, Great Britain said, we don't want to have these constant devaluations. Because every time there's a devaluation, it makes our products now become more expensive, right? Relative to people in that country, it seems like they need more of their currency to buy our products. Instead of 10 pesos, it's not going to take 20 pesos for them to buy one of our products. So what we want to do then is we're going to demand. We are the hegemon, and if anyone wants to do business with us, the largest economy of the era in the 18th century, 19th century, if anyone wants to do business with Great Britain, well, they're simply going to have to adopt a fixed exchange rate. We can't handle these constant devaluations. And so this is when Great Britain, it took a while for them to come up with this plan, but this is when Great Britain in the late 1800s established the gold standard. And the gold standard said this. The gold standard said, we are now beginning an era of fixed exchange rates. And so Great Britain said what that means is we are going to peg our currency, the British pound, to the price of gold. Gold is a stable thing. The price doesn't vary that much. It's very solid, stable. Everyone knows the price of gold. We're going to peg our currency. We're going to keep it pegged to the price of gold. And so we would ask that everyone else that we do business with not to have these constant evaluations, but instead to keep their currencies also pegged to the price of gold. So this is the gold standard. And this happened in the heyday of British hegemony when Britain was the dominant economy. It could tell other countries, if you want to do business with Great Britain, if you want our wonderful manufactured goods, and if you want access to our very large, powerful market, then you better adopt the gold standard as well. Peg your currency to the price of gold. So this began the era of fixed exchange rates, okay? So what's interesting about this is that now it was a really wonderful situation in some ways because there wasn't really a liquidity problem. Back in the days when all you had was gold and silver to exchange, you had to carry the gold and silver around in your pocket, right? Now you could carry British pounds. Great Britain promised everyone that they would keep enough British pounds in their vaults to back up the value of their currency. So literally, the pound was as good as gold. And so that means you could carry British pounds around. There was liquidity. There was money in circulation. At the same time, people had confidence in this money. They knew it was literally as good as gold, the British pound. So this era of fixed exchange rates was really, there was a booming economy. There was a growth in the economy. There was great prosperity. There were so many real great things that happened during this time. And there was free trade because Great Britain was demanding that. As the hegemon, it was able to demand that, and it wasn't worried about importing coconuts and things from other countries. So Great Britain did impose trade barriers, and it demanded that everyone else that traded with Great Britain do the same. So the only real difficulty was the adjustment mechanism. And of course, if you're a poor country and you're importing all these manufactured goods from Great Britain, well, there are declining terms of trade for commodities relative to manufactured goods. So if you're a poor country exporting a commodity like coconuts and you're importing, railroad cars and things like that from Great Britain, oh my gosh, you're going to have a trade deficit. So because everybody was on the gold standard that was doing business with Great Britain, you couldn't just print a lot of currency and devalue your way out of the trade deficit and boost your exports that way. Of course, you had to keep your currency fixed to the price of gold. And so the only mechanism for adjustment, for getting your trade back out of the big deficit into balance, was, I guess, the prices for your products, your commodities, had to fall lower and lower and lower until finally you could sell them again. And you had to go through kind of a deep recession and a prolonged, painful process it was. So no wonder that there were some downsides to being on the fixed exchange rate system. There was definitely some disadvantages to this, but it certainly did create a stable exchange rates, and it did lead to the rapid expansion of trade, and there was minimal inflation, but there was this very painful adjustment process, okay? Now, you might notice that it all came to an end in 1914. So what happened in 1914, of course, was the terrible World War I. And during World Wars, all these little rules like this go out the window. Nobody pays attention to this. So the gold standard ended in 1914. World War I lasted from 1914 until 1918. And what is significant is that after World War I, Great Britain was so weakened by that war. It had spent so much money, lost so many people. It was just a terrible, devastating experience for Great Britain. They said, we can't be the hegemon anymore. And so after World War I, there was no hegemon. The United States apparently wasn't yet willing or ready to be the hegemon. And we call this period the interwar period between World War I and World War II. So during this time, there was no hegemon, and look, what did you have? You had no hegemon there to enforce the rules, to try to impose fixed exchange rates. So if you notice from my subtitles up here, the rise and fall of hegemonic dominance is correlated with the rise and fall of fixed exchange rates. So between 1918 and 1945, no hegemon. We also don't have any fixed exchange rates. And countries began just devaluing their currencies, trying to get an advantage over others. One country would devalue its currency, then another country would devalue its currency. We call this competitive devaluations. And these constant devaluations, and the way countries did this, of course, were just printing a lot of their local currency, increasing the supply to devalue that currency and make their products cheaper relative to countries that had stronger, stable currencies. And this process of printing so much local currency meant a lot of that local currency was sloshing around, chasing after they didn't increase the amount of goods and services, just more money, chasing after those goods and services. That drove up the prices, and inflation was just rampant. And in some places like Germany, during what they called the Weimar Republic, this is before World War II, we had hyperinflation coming back in some of these places. So this is what happens when you don't have a hegemon. We also saw things like the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 in the United States. You know, when the U.S. stock market collapsed in 1929, the U.S. did not respond as a hegemon would by, no, we're going to keep our market open. We want everyone to keep trading with us, and we're going to keep your markets open. We demand that you do that if you want to trade with us. That's what a hegemon can do. But the United States instead acted like a weaker country and closed its markets. And the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was the most protectionist legislation anyone had ever seen in the history of the world. It was the highest increase in import taxes, essentially closing the U.S. to exports to other countries. So that meant that other countries said, well, if the United States is going to do that, we'll do that as well. And that meant the United States now found its export markets shut down and closed. And so many people believe that this is really what helped contribute not just to the financial crisis of 1929, the aftermath of that, and this closing of the markets contributed to the worldwide Great Depression that lasted for a decade. So too little, too late. The U.S. passed something called the Reciprocal Trade Act, where we try to open up our market. If you open your market to us, we'll open our market to you. But that wasn't enough, and the Great Depression continued. So it wasn't until after World War II, when the United States began to emerge as a new hegemon, that we were able to again establish fixed exchange rates. And this is when the United States and Great Britain and a lot of other countries that were the allies in World War II came together, and they had a conference at a little town in the state of New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. And at this conference, this became a very famous place because of this conference. In this little town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, they had this conference, and that's where they decided these will be the rules when this world war is over. They had the conference in 1944. The war didn't even end until 1945. But even in 1944, it was clear that the United States was going to win the war and its allies, and there was going to be a new possibility to have a reset and go back to some kind of stable exchange rates. So in 1944, the Bretton Woods Conference, it was decided that everybody would go back to some system of fixed exchange rates, that the United States dollar would be the currency that would be pegged to the value of gold. In fact, they set a very specific rate, $35 for an ounce of gold, and that rate would not vary. And it did not vary until 1971, and we'll get into what happened there. But essentially, everyone went back to the fixed exchange rates, and all the other countries in the world agreed that they also would peg their currencies to the value of the dollar. And essentially now we're back on the fixed exchange rates. And people knew that if there was a problem and a country had a big trade deficit and was tempted to devalue its currency in the old way, that could just destroy the system. So what they decided to do was to create a fund. They called it the International Monetary Fund. And the purpose of this fund would be to help countries in these big trade deficit kind of situations so they would not devalue their currencies and to help them stay on the fixed exchange rate system. And so this was fantastic until an economist named Dr. Triffin, a famous economist at Yale University, noticed, wait a minute, there's some great things happening here. The US dollar is pegged to the price of gold. It is backed by the gold in the US vaults. Everyone has confidence in the dollar. There is great liquidity, but he noticed that the more dollars that went out into circulation, more and more dollars, the more people began to question, wait a minute, even though there's more liquidity, do we really have confidence? If everyone turned in all their dollars to the U.S. government at once, could they cough up enough gold, to give me my $35? Here's my ounce of gold. Do they have enough gold? So the U.S. did not have that. There were too many dollars in circulation. So that was the dilemma that Dr. Triffin noticed. And so ultimately, that is why in 1971, we had to go off of this fixed exchange rate system again. And we did. And it just happened to be that Richard Nixon was president of the United States. Any president would have done the same. But the United States said, we can't sustain this anymore. We have a big trade deficit of our own. And in fact, there are other countries that are now competing with us that are exporting a lot of manufactured goods to us. Europe and Japan and others have recovered from World War II. We have a big trade deficit, and sorry, we're going to have to put up tariffs, dramatic increase in tariffs. So many people say that 1971 was the year that U.S., technically speaking, no longer was a hegemon, that U.S. hegemony ended 1971. Now, Clearly, the United States remained the dominant power of the capitalist global economy, but if you look at hegemony as maintaining fixed exchange rates, always keeping a policy of free trade, tactically speaking, that did end in 1971, and we went on to a system of flexible exchange rates. So when the U.S. devalued the currency again, is when actually other countries realized that there was no reason in pegging their currency to the dollar anymore if the U.S. was going to keep doing this. And finally, the International Monetary Fund, remember, its whole mission was to help maintain fixed exchange rates, to help countries in a trade deficit situation, to help them through that so they wouldn't devalue their currencies. Now the IMF realized that fixed exchange rates were a thing of the past, because when the United States devalued the dollar for a second time in 1973, everyone said, well, there's no reason for us to maintain fixed exchange rates and peg our currency to the dollar. So that's when they had a big conference. They called it the Jamaica Conference. It was held in Jamaica. And finally, the IMF acknowledged, okay, our mission to maintain fixed exchange rate has come to an end, but we have a new mission. Our new mission is to monitor countries and help them maintain stable exchange rates, and to monitor them, engage in surveillance on them to make sure that they aren't surreptitiously devaluing their currency, manipulating their exchange rate just to get an unfair advantage over other countries. So this became the new IMF role, and we'll talk more about the International Monetary Fund in the next segment, but that is how we got to the current situation we're at now, where countries' exchange rates do fluctuate and they are flexible, but the IMF monitors them and ensures that they are not engaged in unfair behavior to get an advantage over other IMF members. And we'll talk about this in more detail in the next segment.